We are thrilled to have our honorable author, Dr.
Thank you very much.
Waleed Ziad with us. His attendance makes this event truly special. To formally begin the event, I would call Mr. Hadi. He will take the floor and the co-host. Over to you.
So, as Nuzhat said, we're very happy to have Dr. Waleed with us here today. I will introduce our host and then I will pass off the floor to him. So, starting off with an ayah from the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Allahu nuru samawati wal ard. And he goes on to say, Nurun ala nur, yahdillahu li nuri, 𝑗'𝒎𝒂𝒔𝒕𝒆𝒓� لِلنَّاسِ وَاللَّهُ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ عَلِيمٌ. To mean that Allah is the light of heavens and the earth. And it goes on to say that light upon light, Allah guides whoever He wills to His light. And Allah sets forth parables for humanity. For Allah has perfect knowledge of all things. To hear and learn of these parables, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Waleed Ziad today here with us. Dr. Waleed Ziad is an associate professor at Georgetown University, Qatar campus. Prior to this, he was an associate professor in the religious studies department at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He has done his research in Islamic law and civilization at Yale. He completed his bachelor's, master's and PhD there. And his dissertation also won this field prize at the university. In the last decade, 𝑴𝒂𝒔𝒕𝒆𝒔 Sahib has conducted fieldwork on historical and contemporary religious revivalism in over 140 towns across Afghanistan, Uzbekistan and Pakistan in various languages, Arabic, Persian, Urdu, Sindhi, even Chaghatai and Romanian. Wonderful. His books include The Hidden Caliphate, Sufi Saints Beyond the Oxus, and which was the winner of the Hurani Prize published by Harvard in 2021. Another book of his is In the Treasure Room of the Sakra King, 𝑦𝒇𝒊𝒂𝒔𝒕𝒆𝒄 from Gandharan Shrines, and Beyond the Khutbah and Sikha, Sovereignty and Coinage in Sin. His articles have appeared in New York Times, Wall Street, Foreign Policy, and other major international journals. Coming to the book and the topic we are about to go on today, I'll keep this short. The extraordinary enchanted lives of the female Sufi masters of the Afghan Empire. The title, which almost seems like a clickbait at first read. It just astounds you for a layman that these sorts of things exist. So this is the first time the story of BB Sahiba is going to be told in English. Someone whose network spanned across thousands of miles from Karachi to Central Asia, who was the spiritual guide of scholars and kings. Remarkably, BB Sahiba was just only one of the many female religious leaders in what was Pakistan and Afghanistan. And her story is critical for the region and understanding the narratives and the context in which all of us reside today. With that, I'll hand over the floor to you, Dr. Waleed Ziad.
मेहरबानी। अस्सलाम वालेकुम हजरात। मैं हजरात ही कह रहा हूँ क्योंकि तसव्वुफ के सिलसिले में लफ्ज़ हजरत तो जन और मर्द दोनों के लिए इस्तेमाल होता है। मैं शुक्रगुजार हूँ जनाब मोहतरम मोहम्मद हादी साहिब का, जिन्होंने मेरा तारुफ किया है। नीज़ रज़ा काज़िम साहिब, मुदीर 𝑻𝒆𝒈 इस्लामाबाद चैप्टर, जिन्होंने इस प्रोग्राम का एहतमाम किया है, और रज़ा तैमूर ख़ान मुमताज़ साहिब जो हमारे कज़न भी हैं, जिन्होंने नहायत मेहरबानी से मुझे यहाँ दावत दी। ख़ुसूसन باعث افتخار من است که در میان شما شنوندگان عزیز بزرگوارانی حضور دارند همینجا که تجربه‌ای عمیق و یقیناً عملی در جهان تصوف دارند. مانند استاد محترم رشید بٹ صاحب. برای من در حقیقت سخن آرایی در این موضوع ناشایسته است، اما به خاطر از اینکه در این مجلس دعوت شده‌ام ناگزیرم چند کلمه عرض کنم به اجازت شما. بسم الله الرحمن الرحیم. I want to continue with gratitude. I was going to say begin with gratitude, but gratitude is what I began with. And, I have to thank hundreds from Pakistan, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, who I've been honored to work with. Great minds, greater hearts. The work that I do is not individual work, it is collective work. I am speaking, but the work I'm speaking of is done by thousands who are far greater than I am. I'm saying this without exaggeration. So before I start, let me throw out a question. How many of you are familiar with any historic female Sufis in places that you may be from, or let's say in and around Islamabad or Pindi? Let me throw out the question. Actually, first let's have a show of hands. How many are familiar with any female Sufi saints in your respective areas or perhaps in Islamabad? Ji. Any names, if I may? Rabi al-Basri, buried in Jerusalem, one of the greatest Muslims of all time. Any other names stand out? Yes, Ji. BB Sahiba, and I would be happy to talk about that later on. That's a very, very interesting story. Anyone else? BB Sahiba or BB Jandodi, bilkul, jinka zikr abhi hoga inshallah. Achha, anyone in Islamabad in Pindi? Okay, great. Excellent. I'm glad because this means I have something to talk about today. The truth is they're everywhere. In every historic graveyard you're going to find traces. Most of us, in fact, already know they're there, but at the same time we don't. They're in our collective memory. Our grandmothers talked about them, our grandfathers talked about them, but somehow they're relegated to some area of our subconscious. That's what I hope to extract today. I don't work in Islamabad, but I've stumbled across two here. Who's been to the hotspot in Saidpur? Has anyone been to the Nazargah of Khwaja Khizr, which is one of the most beautiful places in Islamabad? And I will fight anyone who disagrees with me. It's a little trail that goes up, and there's a gorgeous, gorgeous tree, hundreds of years old. There is a grave of a khadima of the shrine who apparently was a local female saint. I haven't looked into it, but I guarantee you there's a story. And there's yet another that I found recently. Around Peshawar, where this story begins, there are countless. Just a few years ago, in Andrun Peshawar, I was led to a 4-generation long lineage of female teachers and Sufi guides. These are the BB Zikris from 1830s onwards, who ran a maktab, a school, where they taught those who were to become the leading scholars of the city. They were the teachers of the ulama of Peshawar. Then in fact, on the same trip that I was introduced to this, on the way back to Islamabad, I was led to this shrine towards Attak, right next to the Indus, of a Sufi sheikh, female Sufi sheikh, who just passed away a couple of decades ago. So I hope this talk can make us aware of some incredible voices, stories, and individuals which are erased from our collective memories. Of course, I'm going to argue that they're there. Once again, we need to be reminded of them. So let's begin with this, Kabul, 1785. Abundant praise be to God, although now the aforementioned Makhduma, literally one who is praised, has no need of idhan, permission, but since it is a tradition of our predecessors that without permission a pir, note the word pir, cannot in this serious matter take a single step, thus in written form it is enshrined that whosoever from all women and men that seek the path of transcendent God can come to her service and take the path from her as if they have received it from this poverty-stricken one. These are the final lines of a diploma issued by Khwaja Safiullah of Kabul, the premier scholar and Sufi of Afghanistan, Balochistan, and Sindh, to his number one student and successor, BB Amatal-Masoom, BB Sahiba Kalan, the Great. Kalan, of course, means elder, great, or exalted. This is a diploma that recognized her as the highest saint of the age. Today we're going to meet the subject of this diploma, this remarkable figure, the female saint and scholar BB Sahiba Kalan, who passed away in 1804, who is designated as the first of the inheritors of the most important Sufi network based in northwestern Pakistan and Afghanistan, with branches stretching from Xinjiang in western China to Sindh. Incidentally, a couple of her family members, her not-so-distant nephews, become kings in western China, in Yarkand and Xinjiang. That's a whole other story I write about elsewhere. In the Shajras, pay close attention to this, her name is directly included in the Sufi golden chain, from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, onwards. Here you see her given name, BB Sahiba, Hazrat Masume. On a versified shajara on the wall of a shrine of a great Kandahari sheikh, she is cited by her takhallus, Hazrat Jan-e-Jahan, 𝑥𝒂𝒔𝒕𝒆𝒃, Khazin, the keeper of the hidden treasure. Now, believe it or not, I also discovered in the course of my research that the second largest religious network in the Afghan Empire, based near Peshawar at exactly the same time, was also led by two generations of women. So you've got one in Kabul and one outside of Peshawar. This is everywhere from Dir to Kohistan, all the way down, literally up to China, Badakhshan, all the way down to Sindh and Karachi to Yemen, are led by two women circa 1800. Also Naqshbandi Mujaddidi, we will get into that. So I've been working on Sufi networks in the region for about 15 years, or more actually, maybe 15, 20 years. My book, which came out a few years ago, Hidden Caliphate, I brought some local copies along, which finally got published. I find it difficult to purchase a $45 copy directly from Harvard. Thankfully, we have some available now. This talks about the pivotal role of Sufis in holding together the Muslim world. Did anyone know that in the 18th and 19th centuries, Peshawar and Bukhara, now in Uzbekistan, were the most famous college towns across Asia, that they used to have academic exchanges? Can I get a show of hands? Peshawar as a college town. That the kings of Central Asia had studied from Sufism from teachers in Peshawar. That the greatest scholars of Siberia and Western China would come to Bukhara to study with Peshawari scholars, or to Kyrgyzstan to study with scholars trained in Peshawar. This is a shameless pitch. If you didn't know this and you're curious, read my book. It's about this intimate, intellectual, spiritual, cultural threads between Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, especially in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. This talk is based on my upcoming book, and it's also an excuse to share several photos from my travels in search of sources, people, and sacred spaces, so it's a bit of a show and tell show as well. So let's begin by setting the stage. We're going to enter into the rich world of Sufism in Afghanistan and Pakistan in the 18th and 19th centuries. Then we'll introduce BB Sahiba and her illustrious career, and together follow her journey into the Afghan heartlands, onwards to the historical, onwards to the holy sanctuaries of Makkah and Medina, and the sacred epicenters of Central Asia, where her story draws to a close. This is Mazar-e-Sharif. At the end, we'll talk about her legacy and the many, many others that came after her. Now, ultimately, what makes this story so fascinating for me is that she and other women of her time were considered paragons of Islamic orthodoxy. They were not rebels or outsiders. They were strict on matters of sunnah, while being publicly engaged and practical spiritual leaders. And all of this was being done within the norms of the strict parda, segregation. So why does BB Sahiba matter today? First, we witness through BB Sahiba the existence of a potent form of female leadership in the geographical belt that stretches from Afghanistan, the Peshawar Valley, Sindh, Central Asia, and beyond. And I argue far beyond. Now, we kind of know that women were active in the religious scholastic sphere in this part of the world. And how do we know this? We know this through scattered references in the hagiographies. Someone will mention that a Khalifa was a woman. We also know this from shrines. There are many, many shrines associated with women in not just this part of the world, but well beyond. But they generally receive little attention because the data just isn't there. And I often ask my students to do this, challenge them to do this. I'm blessed to have a couple here, go to one of these female-led shrines and ask the khadim there, who was this individual? Do this in Ud Sharif, for example. And what you're going to get is, ji namaz ki paband thi, wo tahajjud ki namazeं अदा करती थी, जी सखी थी, परहेजगार थी, पर्देदार थी, सखी थी, परहेजगार थी, पर्देदार थी, and it keeps repeating on and on. And sometimes it gets bizarre. Often they're chaste. Sometimes the lady gets swallowed up by the ground to preserve her chastity, and the story stops. The colonial sources, God forbid, would they ever acknowledge female religious leaders? And I'll give you a stark and very disturbing example. The great 19th century Richard Burton, which our educated classes love to quote. You'll see a copy of Burton actually in every bookshelf in sort of English language bookshelf in Sindh. It's the guy who translated Arabian Nights, secretly went to Hajj. He mentions a female saint of his time in Sindh. And she's of the very same Naqshbandi Mujaddidi silsila as BB Sahiba. And he says nothing except, Sallallahu, that she must have been sexually promiscuous. These are his words. In other words, the only way that the simpleton could conceive of women in authority was by degrading them and by sexualizing them. Now this makes sense because Victorian mores and ideals of behavior did not leave any room for women who could assert themselves, especially in traditional settings, and we see this problem today. The parda is equated with lack of authority, lack of agency, right? There's this constant equation. The parda, of course, has been weaponized for the last 150 years as the part of the civilization project is about removing the parda and emancipating. God forbid could a woman in a veil exercise agency, and this is a big reason why none of us have really heard of Muslim female Sufi masters. It's not in the inherited logic. It requires looking outside our comfort zones. And as I said, it's actually weirdly within and outside our comfort zones because part of us are Victorian, most of us in this room, myself included, and part of us have memories of our grandparents and great-grandparents. This is the greatest part of doing the work. You ask people initially and they don't remember, and then all of a sudden someone remembers something, and then all of a sudden the floodgates open up. About 14 years ago, when I was traveling from Kabul to Mazar-e-Sharif, I found a book, 550 pages long, in Persian and Arabic, which to my surprise contained the most complete, okay, let's say one of the most complete, all right, just to be safe, hagiographic accounts of a woman scholar saint in the early modern period. And this is how I met BB Sahiba. It was a chance encounter that actually blew my mind. I was not intending on studying this. It turns out that this book, the principal biography of BB Sahiba's Sufi lineage, her silsila, was compiled by her son only 14 years after her death. So he was at once her cherished son, he was her travel companion, he was her confidant, and he was her disciple. So he was able to furnish intimate details of his mother's career, even capturing her emotional state in formative moments of her life, even capturing her tears. Her voice was preserved. Then, as I traveled, more sources kept pouring in, and I kept following the leads. In Matiari in Sindh, north of Hyderabad, it's a phenomenal town if you haven't been there, I finally discovered her daughter's shrine, and met her descendants who graciously shared with me their manuscripts. And afterwards, I was able to collect oral histories and books in about 25 towns, as far as Tharparkar, I would say more or less 35 towns or so, as far as Tharparkar, where her descendants and followers had settled, in the process discovering over a dozen more female Sufi masters connected with her Sufi lineage, with huge followings. I'm not talking about a woman here with 5 sahelis sitting around doing dhikr, with no offense to that at all intended. We're talking disciples in the thousands and tens of thousands. We're talking spiritual political powerhouses. There are so many leads now, so many people invested in this project, so many new names of female saints introduced to me that sometimes I have to tell people just to hold back. I'll give an example of how the research unfolds. My students have seen this picture, perhaps. A little while back, I get a WhatsApp message from Kandahar, Afghanistan. A gentleman sends me the picture to the right. My picture with this green kind of circle around my face. And he says, "Is this you?" And I respond and I say, "Yes, this is me." And then he tells me he's heard about me from a young Afghan Sufi and Hakim in Tharparkar, who in turn had heard about me through his friends in the Malakan agency. Very good friend of mine now. In fact, he just called me last week and I missed him. Now, it turns out that this gentleman, then he sends me a picture of himself. He presides over BB Sahiba's family shrine in Kandahar, where her son and her husband are buried. And he informed me that they have many documents they'd like to share with me. Within a day or two, I receive a very rare hagiography from Kandahar that I had never seen before, all of course over WhatsApp. Now, it's vital to note that the story that I'm about to tell is not just about BB Sahiba, it's about a much larger story of hundreds of such contemporary women who are marginalized in the sources. It provides context for many female religious leaders in Central and Southern Asia, the one whose shrines dot the landscape, but whose stories are now unheard. The story, of course, also uncovers this vibrant intellectual cultural scene of Afghanistan and Pakistan, which have been treated like civilizational trash heaps in the global media. I don't need to really cover it up. That's exactly what they've been treated as. If more of us, of course, knew that the governor of Kabul under Akbar was a woman, Bakhtun Nisa, who was sent there to quell a rebellion. My mother informed me of this first. And also that the governors of Kabul and Peshawar under 𝑭𝒆𝒂𝒍𝒆 were a husband and wife team. That the governor of Punjab briefly, while BB Sahiba was in the area in her early age, was also a woman very close to 𝑚𝒦𝒐𝒊. That another, as I discovered, Khan of estate in Dir for 35 years was also a woman in the 19th century who had great relations with one of the female sheikhs who I'm studying. Perhaps this story would be a little easier to digest. Or, of course, that the golden age of a forgotten kingdom in Balochistan was under a female ruler in the 18th century, who I'm currently working on. I finally located her tomb, let's say about a year ago. Now, this work is not straightforward. Sometimes you have to travel hours into the wilderness to track down one source, and it's not there, and sometimes magic happens. Magic. My dear colleague, the historian Malik Farooq Chamkani, took me in search of sources on a female saint outside of Peshawar. On his way, he tells me about a biography that has been lost for over a generation. Keep talking about this lost biography. At one stage, we're sitting at a Sufi dargah, and the sheikh there mentions that there's some farmer who has a book in his possession, and he has wrapped up this book in 7 layers of cloth, and he uses it to settle disputes. Kind of, when there's cattle, he'll kind of move it around and heals the cattle. If there's a problem in the family, the book apparently solves the problem. Just so happens that when we're sitting there, the gentleman drops by. And it turns out he's got the book on him, and it turns out to be the very book that was lost for a generation. The journeys have their own moral logic. I think all of us know this already, and I can see by the look on all of your faces that you are more familiar with this than I am. I see someone in the back who does a lot of these journeys and understands the moral logic very well. I traveled a lot with my friend, Sufi author, bookseller in Kabul, Fakir Khakrub, sweeper. This is Takhallus. I recall one of the most memorable trips to the mountains in the Kapisa province to visit BB Sahiba's son's Khanaqah. Kapisa was at that time still inhabited by insurgents. On the way in Parvan, we stopped by at a roadside mechanic's stop, and there's a Sufi there who, having lost his ability to walk, apparently he'd sat there in Khalwa for 2 decades. So he met us, and then he insisted that we need security for our trip because, of course, the insurgency. But the security was to be the following act. And I apologize, this is these things can get sometimes quite emotional. We were to purchase 20 naans per passenger. There were 4 of us there, so we had 160 naans. And on the way back, we had to distribute them to the needy. So we eventually arrived at this idyllic monastic complex. And after meditating in silence, 𝑭𝒒𝒔𝒕𝒊 led the community there in physically sweeping the shrine. Now, keep in mind that I had gone there to look for manuscripts. What happens there? There's muraqabah, there's meditation, and we get together with the community and we sweep the shrine. That's it. And 𝒒𝒔𝒕𝒊 is an intellectual, he's an academic, he knows exactly what I'm looking for. Then the journey home was punctuated with stops in villages where he would greet people on the street, inquire about their professions, and if found to be needy, he would distribute bread. I remember once he goes to someone and he says, "Who are you?" He says, "I'm a naan boy. I sell naan." And he said, "All right, take a naan." And so it was this kind of bizarre experience going back home. One of the best things about the journey is the trust and mutual support and the generosity. In my work, I traveled across 15 provinces in Afghanistan. By God's grace, by road, with no security, never felt unsafe. Now, let's set the stage. It's a long setting of the stage here, so bear with me here. Feel free to walk out if the stage is too long. Now, our story begins in Afghanistan and Pakistan, spilling into India, Uzbekistan, and the Arabian Peninsula. It's 1750. A new Durrani empire has grown up around 3 capital cities, around Kabul, Kandahar, and Peshawar. At its height, the empire stretches from northern India all the way to eastern Iran, with a tenuous hold over much of Central Asia. So what happens? Students, artists, scholars from China to Istanbul start flooding into these towns. They become cosmopolitan centers, hosting dozens of major colleges. I was speaking of the great ones and the teachers in the audience, and yet another has just joined. Now I feel all the more so put on the spot. So each of these cities now have dozens of major colleges and vibrant Armenian, Christian, Hindu, Jewish, Sikh, Shia, Sunni communities. Remarkably, the kings are generally Sunni, the governors are Shia. This is BB Sahiba's world. So now let's introduce Sufism. I'll try to go through this fast, again, knowing the audience. Sufism is, of course, the mystical core of Islam. It's an actual science, right? At this stage, it's an actual science of inner purification, eliminating the ego self through rigorous practices, through meditation, through dhikr, through seclusion, through ethical conduct, through social service, which is the core, and in many traditions, sacred movement and music. And I will actually argue in my book that the real core of the Khanaqah is not the place where you teach, it's not the mosque, it's actually the place where the food is served. This is a core part of the book, and a lot will make sense when we start looking at literally the dasarkhan, the langar. Now, Sufi teachings, of course, had distinct schools. They're called turuq, which is a plural of tariqa or path. Each has their own methods of meditation, philosophies, and practices. By the 11th century, Sufism was synthesized with the other core Islamic sciences like law, theology, astronomy, philosophy. So the most important take-home here is that from very early on, Sufism was an integral component of Orthodox Islam, a companion to Islamic law. Law regulates the outer life, tasawwuf guides the inner life. It's as simple as that. I tell my students this, I always bring this point across through this following very crude analogy. It's not even an analogy, really. Look at it this way, that if there is a faqih, a lawyer, who is brilliant at law and has not controlled her or his inner self, the nafs, then that lawyer is likely to become a blood-sucking lawyer. And if you have a Sufi sheikh who's got access to unveilings, can read other people's faces, but is not bound within the strictures of Sharia, then that person is liable to become a cult leader. Many of us know what I'm talking about here. All right. So, tasawwuf is not a joke in 18th century Kabul or Peshawar. This means that whether you're, again, BB Sahiba, when she's in Kabul, Peshawar, or Lahore, she and her companions could not be religious scholars unless they were practicing Sufis and vice versa. This is difficult, of course, for Muslims today to comprehend. We're so divorced from our tradition that we don't realize that about 2 generations ago, all of our families had an affiliation with some Sufi tariqah. And tasawwuf provided the moral framework through which our society operated, really from top to bottom. It was the language that really is where the space where the king could sit with the beggar, right? The democratizing space. It was the Sufi centers that provided the soup kitchens, the lodging for the poor and travelers, the health services, the full social services were provided in the khanaqahs. So if you're living in, let's say, 18th century Kabul or Peshawar, and you wanted to be a scholar like Bibi Sahiba, you'd begin by going to elementary school or maktab. Then you'd go to a madrasa for higher education, where you'd learn law, poetics, grammar, medicine, you study the Masnavi. And then the PhD program was the Sufi Center, where you'd begin the inner sciences. And in addition to this, we're going to add the Haram Sarai, which is a female-led institution within the Sufi Center, which is illuminated uniquely through this study. By the 18th century, the Sufi path, the mystical journey, was down to a science. You had teachers' textbooks, you had stages of mystical growth laid out, debates on those stages, literally step-by-step guidelines on how to become enlightened. Now, each Sufi path expanded by appointing multiple deputies. The word is Khalifa, right, the one who follows. And they would start new schools and train new students. So it's kind of a hub-and-spoke model. Bibi Sahiba belonged to the Naqshbandi Sufi tariqat, Naqshbandi Mujaddidi Sufi tariqat. We'll call them Mujaddidis for short. What are some defining features? It's the most expansive network in the Muslim world before the 20th century, from Indonesia to Bosnia. Bibi Sahiba's own lineage is actually still the most important religious network in Afghanistan today. 𝑭𝒆𝒊 Mujaddidi, the president after the Civil War, was actually the descendant of her teacher. Now they are Sunnis and they venerate the Imams, like all pre-modern Sunnis. They had very sophisticated and scientific methods of inner purification, which were grounded in the Quran and Sunnah. With specific meditations and breathing practices, they could enliven metaphysical centers which were mapped onto the human physical body. They're almost like receptors to receive divine energy. There are certain hints that are given in the scriptures about the ruh, the qalb, the nafs, various other of these organs, and this is the science of how to really work with and activate the organs. And through all of these, you could journey towards self-realization with 30 to 50 plus stages. For those who may not know, this, by the way, for those who do know, you'll notice this map is wrong. I found this online. There are problems in this map, so don't hold me accountable for that. It's got the nice human kind of figure on it so you can follow it. The old maps are kind of linear and whatnot. They're hard to follow. This was Orthodox Islamic practice. Everyone from the great Al-Ghazali to the founders of the Deoband Madrasa are writing on the subtle centers. Shah Waliullah Dehlavi is most famous for his writings on this. Everyone from the peasant to the Ottoman kings and the Mughal princesses are practicing this. I actually located over 20 letters written by the Mujaddidi Sufi masters, Bibi Sahiba's very close ancestors, to Mughal princesses. Aurangzeb's sister, the Padishah Begum Roshanara, the most powerful woman in the world, and his daughter, the poet Zebunissa Begum, and others, which show that they were not just training in the Sufi sciences, but had actually become Khalifas with their own students. We actually have names in these letters of Roshanara's students. Believe it or not, all of this was orthodoxy. And the point within particularly this Sufi path is not to achieve ecstasy or union or go into a hal and kind of lose yourself, become mast, but to become a servant of God and God's creation, a sober teacher who can guide others, who is practical, engaged, and enlightened, one who is steadfast on the Sharia. Is everyone with me here? This is BB Sahiba's world. All right, I told you the stage setting is very, very long. Now, on to the story. BB Sahiba's Pir, Khwaja Safiullah, Hazrat Qayyum al-Jahan, as everyone in Afghanistan will know him today, was the most renowned Sufi scholar of the Durrani Empire. In the 1770s, he set up a college in Kabul at Shor Bazar, a magical neighborhood, to date, of musicians and storytellers and mystics in the heart of the city, and he pulled in students from as far afield as Balochistan and Bajor to Badakhshan in the Pamir Mountains, including, in fact, the most famous poet of Badakhshan at the time. By the way, as an aside, this is a time when one of Kabul's greatest poets, who wrote a several hundred-page divan, was a woman. Aisha Durrani, incidentally, her works are the first book, the first lithograph ever published in Afghanistan in the latter 19th century. Now, Khwaja Safiullah was revered by two Afghan kings. In 1793, the king Shah Zaman actually walked on foot from Kabul's royal citadel to the alleyways of Shor Bazar so that Khwaja Safiullah would tie his coronation turban, perform his dastarbandi. He appointed over 30 deputies to manage his sacred scholastic network, which extended from Central Asia to the Kabul highlands and the Pakhtun tribal regions to Balochistan and Sindh. His khalifas included the top scholars of the time. Just in Sindh alone, Makhdoom Ibrahim Tatvi, the grandson of Makhdoom Hashim, if anyone knows the spiritual landscape of Sindh or Makkah and Medina, because this is one of the most important networks in Makkah and Medina. Hashim Tatvi has over 30 works in Arabic, Persian, and Sindhi on meditation, on poetry, on law. He is said to have initiated 200,000 students from Thatta to Gujarat. His silsila is still very, very much alive from Gujarat, Bombay. Then you had Qazi Muhammad and Abdullah Nasrpuri, the most famous family of judges in Sindh. Their works have been published by Al-Azhar in Cairo. Abdul-Wahid Sivistani from Sevan. The most famous family, he is the most influential jurist of Sindh at the time. His magnum opus was this huge book called the Bayaz-e-Wahidi. It's about several thousand pages on legal opinion and method, and there was a copy in every madrasa in Sindh. What's great about this book is it kind of goes between Arabic and Persian and Sindhi, and then we'll use a whole set of kind of Sindhi examples to tie into juristic theory. So, among all of these giants, the Khalifa Awwal, the first of the Khalifas, was BB Sahiba Kalan. In the biographies, she is described as the first and the most perfect and the great deputy. Now, BB Sahiba was born in Peshawar in 1752 and hailed from a scholarly, saintly family of Sayyids, originally from Bukhara in Uzbekistan. We talked about this shrine. Someone mentioned it. If you've been to Uj Sharif, this is her ancestral home. As a side note, it's interesting that her great-great-great aunt, about 320 years earlier, was a female saint, BB Jaiwindi, BB Jandodi, about whom we know very little, except her spectacular shrine indicates that she was a noteworthy figure. A very dear friend of mine, who has a phenomenal library in the vicinity near Gujar Khan, had found 15 sources on the Bukhari Sayyids of Uj Sharif that mention BB Jaiwindi. Guess what each of the sources say? She was pious, Sakhiti, and then they mention someone called Dilshad, who's the Padishah of Khorasan, who built her shrine. There is no Dilshad. All right? Case in point. Now, at an early age, in Peshawar, BB Sahiba had memorized the Quran. She'd studied fiqh, theology, Greco-Arabic medicine. This is hikmat. She was a hakim. And at age 7, even began her training in mysticism. She gives a first-hand account of the time when she's inducted into the order and the emotions that she feels when that happens. It's absolutely unbelievable. The college in Peshawar that she grows up in was a spectacular place. There are many acres of lands, there's gardens, there's courtyards. All that's left now is a little garden shrine in the middle of, who knows Peshawar well here? Shobha Bazaar. Yeah. the used auto parts market. And in fact, you have to walk through the alleyways of clanking metal and grease. Then you enter into this little sort of turn left into this serene little garden that emerges out of nowhere. It's really quite an experience. Anyway, back when BB Sahiba was there, and she was young, there were so many women at this Sufi center that some nearby scholars even registered a complaint, and I'd be happy to talk about that. As I mentioned, she'd spent part of her time in Lahore. Most certainly, she crossed paths with the then governor she was a governor for about 6 to 8 months or maybe even a year, who I mentioned was also a woman who was an Ehrari Khwaja, who's a descendant of Khwaja Abdullah Ehrar, who's one of the most famous Naqshbandi sheikhs. So you've got a network of these Sufi women who are spread all across this zone. In the 1760s, BB Sahiba felt the need to put this Peshawar scene. Of course, we're talking about Barda and how women will travel, and of course, you're all familiar with the system of communication and transport between homes. In the 1760s, BB Sahiba arrives in Kabul and Kandahar. In 1769, she marries a distant relative, 4 years her younger. Her husband also becomes a reputed Sufi and poet. He's got a great versified book on the subtle centers that's been, in fact, in Afghanistan and Sindh, that's available as a Sindhi translation and an Urdu translation of the original Persian. Husband and wife often lived apart. Her husband was often on the road. She managed the Sufi center in Kabul while pursuing her own training. In fact, this is a representation, an 1840s representation of the Kandahari institution. Over the next 2 decades, she educated hundreds of scholars and Sufis. She was financially independent, and she and her husband inherited, in fact, several thousand acres of land around Kandahar, which the governors had granted for their scholastic endeavors. Oral histories tell us that a large portion of this was transformed into a wildlife preserve where hunted animals would come to take refuge. In fact, there's a very interesting moment where later on the king of Afghanistan, back then a prince, Amir Abdul Rahman, who's trying to throw his weight around, comes into this wildlife refuge and tries to hunt an animal, upon which the retainer of BB Sahiba's grandson actually takes the king and throws him off the horse. The biographical narratives allow us to reconstruct the sources and the nature of BB Sahiba's authority and what this would imply at a day-to-day level. Her authority is defined through several titles. There's the Khalifa Awwal, the first of the successors. This is her vis-a-vis her teacher, right? So she's the teacher's Khalifa. There's the Pir, which is the Sufi master in her own right of the students and the community at large. Then the most important is Fatima Isani. And I'm going to leave that for something to read about in the book, because this is what the entire book revolves around, what it means to be Fatima Isani. Now, the biographical episodes that focus on her teacher, Khwaja Safiullah, where BB Sahiba actually plays a secondary role, are perhaps the most revealing with regards to her association with him. She's the personal confidant. She's the manager of the affairs of the Sufi center. She's the voice of reason. In these stories, we often encounter her own voice as the narrator or catch glimpses of her daily activities. This whole project is about catching the glimpses. My whole question is, how does this happen? What is going on? What do the Sufi centers look like? Now, consider this episode. In the 1780s, Khwaja Safiullah was in a state of advanced meditation where worldly possessions lost all meaning, in a state of jazb. Now, he had a sizable library of books, and he had just ordered that they be donated to the poor, because again, why does he need books? BB Sahiba steps in and decides to preserve the library. The poor, she said, need food, not manuscripts. She purchases all the books with her own money, and then she distributes an equivalent amount to the poor to fulfill her teacher's niyyah. Among the books preserved is a Quran dated 608 Hijri from Baghdad, now sitting with her descendants in southern Punjab. In fact, a lot of the books are still there. This is one among several episodes in which we learn about her financial independence and her wealth, through which she carried out charitable activities and building projects. Now, after finishing her training, Khwaja Safiullah issues BB Sahiba the 3-page diploma that we began with, indicating that she had mastered the Sharia. In fact, what happens is she has her 3 children, and she symbolically asks permission from her husband, and then she's in Kabul the entire time, and then she goes through her training once again. And at this stage, she gets this 3-page diploma, which designates her as the Qayyum of the age. This is the greatest Sheikh of the age, the successor to Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi, and the teacher assigns all of his thousands of disciples, male and female, to her charge. Now, I had a question about what happens with regards to the senior disciples like Makhdoom Ibrahim Tatvi, and I think you saw in the beginning that the actual shajras include her name as the core, the mahvar, the focal point of the silsila. As it turns out, Ibrahim actually now becomes her disciple. Now, this document, it's an incredible document, which I can speak of at length. Among its noteworthy points are its lack of gender specificity, although her teacher actually painstakingly outlines each of her degrees and spiritual attainments. So with this document, she becomes the peer, she becomes the master. In fact, it really is an incredible document because each of the spiritual rungs that she travels are listed, and her attainments, and then it gets to a certain point where it says, and beyond that, the hadith of the throats would be cut. That we cannot talk about them because they are things that cannot be uttered. So now, the sources, as a Sufi master, BB Sahiba would have had the following responsibilities. She directs women's meditation. She imparts literacy through the Quran to women, even advice on hygiene and health. Gives lectures on hadith, jurisprudence, and tasawwuf to advanced students. She administers medical remedies and faith healing, and what we may today call mental health services. We can get into this if you like. It's a fascinating topic. Just recently, in fact, my mother was with me on this particular field trip where we uncovered a whole library from the early locked up from the early 1900s of medical documents from within BB Sahiba's silsila, in which you actually have now nuskhat of her son and many of her disciples in there. The sources tell us that BB Sahiba taught men and women from both within and outside the family, even imparting spiritual guidance to the senior deputies of Khwaja Safiullah through a veil or a curtain. With the order well established from Sindh to Kabul, BB Sahiba regularly receives delegations of Sufis and scholars. They're now coming to see her. The sources relay a story concerning a caravan that arrives at the Sufi center in Kabul, led by a famous poet and darwish, Ahmad Khan Nizamani, who carries with him some halwa. He's from this tiny village called Nimjogot, which is now 4 hours from Karachi. BB Sahiba dispatches her son to receive the guest, and she specifically instructs her son, who's about 9 or 10 years old, later to become a great Sufi Sheikh and Mujahid, this time a young lad. She says, meet Ahmad Khan and request a prayer from him. Her young son greets him, but he's disturbed by his unfamiliar features and the darker complexion that he's not used to. He returns to his mother, and he ashamedly admits that because of his appearance, he didn't ask for his prayers. BB Sahiba is upset and tells her son, do not consider his physical appearance, as his heart is as luminous as the full moon, or he is the sun and the moon, in another rendition of this. When I approach the court of our Prophet, peace be upon him, I see Ahmad Khan Nizamani seated at his feet. We are not given this honor. The story affirms her wisdom and spiritual insight that can overcome racial difference and allows her practically to provide spiritual oversight over a vast multicultural zone. This is as much a spiritual story as it is a practical story. Right? Tolerance is not just about being good, it also works. Last year, in fact not last year, a couple of years ago, I met Nizamani's relatives, his descendants, at his village who confirmed their narrative of the story and actually shared with me a late 18th century Quran translated into Persian that Ahmad Khan Nizamani had written out at Nimjogot village. So again, it gives you the sense of the cosmopolitanism of the age. Now, the narratives at Kabul and Kandahar and Peshawar and elsewhere bear witness to the development of the Haram Sarai. It's a space of spiritual training presided over by women, which exists in parallel to the male-dominated institutions. It's a critical part of the larger institutional complex and essential to the teaching of Sufism, attracting scores of women disciples and providing social services and even mental health services to women. BB Sahiba administers the Haram Sarai. She presides over assemblies and delivers lectures there. One very famous lecture she delivered on Rabia of Basra, Rabia al-Adawiyya. The Haram Sarai has its own meditation rooms, its storehouses, its stables, its own finances and endowments, and its own parallel system of distributing khairat, both to Muslims and Hindus in Kabul. Now, in 1797, something quite extraordinary happens. BB Sahiba joins her teacher and over 300 companions for a historic Hajj voyage, 315 as per the oral records. Keep this number in mind, 315. Through a historic Hajj journey through Kandahar, Balochistan, down to Lasbela and to a little fishing village called Karachi, Bandar-e Karachi. And from there they go to Oman, where in fact, there's a whole lot of their disciples there who were initiated. It's one of the major scholarly tribes of Oman, who was initiated actually by their women who had first, in fact, chosen to enter into the path. And then they go to Yemen and beyond. She's accompanied by her daughter, BB Sahiba II, the younger, BB Amatullah, who is a young scholar and Sufi in her own right, and she's with her two sons, one of whom writes down the events of the physical and the spiritual journeys. For BB Sahiba, the journey was the transformative experience where she reaches her spiritual zenith and attained the full authority, really, of, well, literally the pinnacle of all authority that could be attained. It was full of adventures. There were sea storms. There's a bigoted, swindling boat captain. One of the people with them writes a travel account of this voyage, and he's just obsessed with how this boat captain cheats them, overcharges them, sits in the shade while all of them have to sit in the sun. It's humorous, but they get there. They get there, and then they get there. They're well. However, on the way, when they reach Hodeidah in Yemen, tragedy happens. 𝑭𝒆𝒈 falls ill. He has a toothache. It becomes infected, and he passes away. The spiritual and financial affairs of the Hajj caravan fall to BB Sahiba. She builds his tomb and a spiritual institution there. In fact, what she does is, at the time, and this has been recorded, she offers to take on all of his debts. Now, all of you know what that means, because that's not just a financial issue. This is a very symbolic action, meaning that the authority is being passed on to her. She leads the whole caravan for Hajj, during which, as related by her sons, she reaches her heights. Each time she approaches the black stone, a voice calls out to her, "Ta'ala ya maqbula, ta'ala ya mahbuba." Then she travels to Medina, where, quote, at every step she received new grants. The Prophet appeared to her and presented her with a green robe and a turban. The Prophet's daughter, Fatima, she says, and now in her own words, kissed my forehead and I was drowned in her association. She asked me to be seated in a way in which an honored guest is received. The first-hand account, this particular account is quite remarkable because part of it is in her words and part of it is in her son's words. Now on the return journey through Sindh, her daughter also falls ill and she dies at Matyari, a medieval pilgrimage town between Hala and Hyderabad. According to popular stories, the body of her daughter is placed on the back of a camel, which was to decide the burial ground. BB Sahiba enters into muraqabah, she enters into meditation, and when she opens her eyes, she refers to Matyari as the chaukat, the asthana, the threshold of Medina. Matyari, unbeknownst to many, is an incredible place. It's said to have the second largest burial ground in Sindh after Makli, supposedly 99 graveyards. Each time I go there, I discover something new. It's one of these just towns, the qasbas, that just keep revealing themselves through layer by layer. So in Matyari, BB Sahiba builds a shrine for her daughter and a mosque and a maktab in her honor, which remain a holy site today. 2 centuries after the fact, BB Sahiba's Hajj is still remembered by the people of Matyari, Muslim and Hindu. So in 2014, when I first went there, I was talking to a Hindu gentleman. He mentions the story of the great caravan and the story of the camel. In fact, for 200 years, all of the great Afghan Mujaddidi Sufis going to Hajj, some of these are really, really well-known figures in Afghan history. Well-known revolutionary, very, very strong orthodox figures for anyone who knows the roles of the Mujaddidis in the 20th century. They would always stop here on the way to Hajj. They would perform muraqabah and have let's call it a conversation with BB Sahiba the Younger, and then they would inscribe poetry in her honor on the walls. So there's actually, in fact, a whole, what would you call it? It's the walls are just scribbled with poetry spanning 200 years of these great Afghans who have visited there. در این روضه که انوار الهی است، تماشا کن که اسرار خدا هست. همیشه خرم و خندان و پرنور. Anyway, it goes on. So now, BB Sahiba from there returns to Kandahar and to Kabul, and then she travels to her spiritual ancestral hometown of Sirhind. So she crosses back to Peshawar, to Lahore, to Sirhind. Then on her return, she receives a rather interesting invitation, and this is from none other than Amir Haydar, the king of Bukhara. Now, Bukhara is the fabled scholastic capital of Central Asia, which along with Peshawar at the time was a great college town, and of course BB Sahiba's ancestral home. At Amir Haydar's time, there were 80 colleges in Bukhara. By his grandson's time, 365. There is a colleague in Tashkent who's actually mapped out the 365. This is not an exaggeration. They likely spent more of their budget on education than the military. This is a fact. For better or for worse. For better, I'm an academic. I need the cash. All right. The incredible thing about Bukhara is that the king was not just a ruler, but a licensed Sufi guide in BB Sahiba's own Sufi path. His teacher was BB Sahiba's contemporary from Peshawar. His teacher was in fact Hazrat Fazl Ahmad of Peshawar, who my book Hidden Caliphate really revolves around. And the king himself lectures several hours a day on academic topics. There's a collection of about 130 letters written between him and his Sufi master. This is the king and the Sufi master. It's incredible because in certain cases the Sufi master will tell off the king for not performing his meditations properly or for not attending to his own students. The king's father, who was a great soldier and empire builder, was also trained by the same Peshawari Sufi, and the king himself used to mend his own clothes and earn a living through making handicrafts. So, BB Sahiba and her 2 sons go to Bukhara and they join scholarly discussions at the Bukharan court. She alone performs meditations at 2 great holy sites, Sayyid Amir Kullal, who is the teacher of Khwaja Bahauddin Naqshband and a founder of the order, and of course at the shrine of Khwaja Bahauddin Naqshband, and the actual muraqabah and the conversations are recorded. Now she leaves Bukhara with her sons, and on the way home, yes, right? So he's believed to be buried in 2 places, Najaf and Mazar, as well as a few others. We can talk about that later, and the dream narrative that uncovers this particular shrine. Now, with BB Sahiba's exalted trans-regional reputation, the caretakers of the Mazar, the Ansari family, this is in fact Atiqullah Ansari of the same family, granted her a saint's funeral. They had to actually break through the stone. It was an 8-hour process of breaking through the stone. And she was given the rare honor of being buried under the 2nd dome of Imam Ali's Mazar. So there are 2 domes. There's the main dome. There's the adjacent annex. It's called the Treasury Annex. There are 2 graves under the Treasury Annex. The first is the first of the Ansaris, who was in fact appointed by Hussein Baikhara, for those who know the history of the Golden Age of Herat. The second is BB Sahiba Kalam. All right. This is huge. Kings are not granted this honor. The first kings, actually, the Afghan kings who are buried, they are not much later into the 19th century. Now her two sons continued the journey home. The elder, Shah Fazlullah, was to become a noteworthy poet and writer, the father of one of Kandahar and Sindh's principal Sufi lineages. The younger becomes a scholar saint of the highlands, north of Kabul, and a key mobilizer against British forces when they invaded Afghanistan in 1839. He was in fact, Shah Zia-ul-Haq Shahid, the younger son, was in fact martyred by the British at the hands of a Muslim assassin during the war. Notice the way in which her story and the two sons mirror the life of 𝑭𝒄𝒔𝒕𝒆𝒄 and her blessed sons. In fact, the poetry that's written around the martyrdom of Shah Zia-ul-Haq Shahid is all Karbala-related poetry. But the story that I'm writing continues well after BB Sahiba's passing away. In the 1880s, a tragedy befalls Afghanistan. British forces invade once again. BB Sahiba's grandsons become mujahids and major military mobilizers at famous battles like the Battle of Mewand. Several family members die fighting. In fact, the Sufi sheikhs, as you may or may not know, in the case of war in, let's say, this whole region, what would happen is there would be the official armies, and then you'd have the Ghazi brigades, which were basically they were really the front line, right? And these were the ones that the British used to call the frontier fanatic. All of these were actually Sufis. In fact, I was reading an account of South Waziristan, account of Varna, which is considered one of the great defeats of British colonial history, and all we know in the British sources is, well, you know, these fanatics come and they kill 2,000 people. From their side, it's, you know, we're in our Hanukkah, we're doing muraqabah, we're having tea, and all of a sudden these people come and invade our land, and we have to convert our Hanukkahs into ammunition factories overnight. And then, of course, hundreds upon hundreds are martyred in the process. Now, in the end, the Afghan forces defeat the British, but after retreating, the British plant their own puppet ruler who starts a bloody purge against the traditional Sunnis, the Shia leadership, the Ismailis, and the pagans of Kafiristan with a British imperial stipend. So Kafiristan becomes Nuristan with a British stipend. It's a fascinating and very tragic story. So the family migrates to Sindh. First to the shrine of BB Sahiba, the younger at Martyari, who starts appearing in the dreams of BB Sahiba's grandson. Then to other places where they set up their Sufi centers and madrasas. Now at this time, a new model of female authority is emerging in this whole region from Afghanistan to Sindh, and actually also in Xinjiang. The women of BB Sahiba's family were all trained scholars and Sufis. Several author fatwas, legal opinions. There are about 4 key figures in the 20th century who are very famous for their fatwas. A great example is BB Sahiba's great-granddaughter Ammaji. Not Bi Amma, but we'll get to Bi Amma. This is Ammaji's mazar, and BB Sahiba the younger is mazar in the back. Ammaji not only performed all-night meditations, but also worked with Bi Amma, the mother of the Ali brothers, who was, in fact, Bi Amma was part of the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi order. So when she came at one stage to Martyari, she came to visit this lady as her pir. Now, together these women mobilized the women of Sindh to support the Khilafat movement. Together they gave public speeches at Martyari. Her son, Ghulam Mujaddid, was in fact the head of the Khilafat movement in Sindh. And in fact, a friend of mine found the police records because the British had their eyes on him, and he was eventually jailed for 2 years, and his mother famously sends him a letter to the effect that if in any way he capitulated to the British, her milk was no longer halal for him. But beyond that, BB Sahiba's grandsons befriended some of the great Sufis in the Thar-Umarkot area, who they appointed as their Khalifas to spread the order from Thar to Rajasthan. This is a part of the story I did not imagine would actually happen. Ended up becoming 30,000 pages in the book, or 40,000, and reduced down to 30,000. This is what takes me to Thar for quite a long time, where I discover at least a dozen women appointed by BB Sahiba's grandsons who headed sizable Sufi orders. What's incredible is that they are strictly orthodox, but half their disciples are Hindus, most of them 𝑭𝒆𝒈𝒊𝒓𝒔, outcasts. All of them were visited and revered by the leading Orthodox Deobandi jurists and theologians of the region. The largest Deobandi madrasa there, the Balhet madrasa, they are the murideen of these great BBs. In fact, I'll mention one later on. The most recent Deobandi head of Balhet is actually the source of a lot of the oral histories and written histories of one of these BBs. And keep in mind that there's a great Kandahari Mujahid who's coming, and he's meeting these individuals and deciding that these are the ones who can actually handle the silsila from Tharparkar to Barmer in Rajasthan and beyond. It's a world that breaks the mold. It certainly made me question things and broke the box in which I was operating. I'd be happy to talk about this later on. The first of these figures is Dadi Mitha, a great saint of 𝑢𝒒𝒑, with hundreds of thousands of devotees all the way to Rajasthan today. She was a faqir who lived humbly in a thatched mud hut, but was visited by male scholars from all of the nearby madrasas who would sit under a tree near the mosque, communicating with her through a window or through messengers. She is actually a Matyari Sayyid by origin. She was famous not only for her towering spiritual presence, said that she had the Ruhani Ghalba over all of the great desert, but she was also famous for negotiating disputes and protecting the rights of peasants. I'll share a story. It's quite long. I'll try to bring it down. In Talar, now in the Indian side of Rajasthan, there were dozens of villages who were Dadi Mitha's disciples. In one of these villages, a man called Pabudan declares himself to be the landlord, and he starts extracting money from the peasants, and he starts harassing them with his armed guards. So a delegation of tribes travels to outside of 𝑢𝒒𝒑 to meet Dadi Mitha, and they ask her to intervene. She agrees to mediate, and she goes there with a force of 250 men and women to negotiate with this rather villainous character, Pabudan, but he refuses and he threatens the group. So what does Dadi Mitha do? She refuses his water. This is a declaration of war. So she goes back and she organizes a defense force of 12 men and systematically plans an attack on Pabudan's armed guards. They manage to overcome the armed guards, who end up actually firing upon themselves. And they take Pabudan and they hang him upside down. He was so humiliated by the event that he visited her and swore never to extort money from the poor again. What's fabulous is that there's so many tribes who actually know this particular history, so you can actually cross-reference a lot of these narratives. This is incredible because here you have a traditionally orthodox woman in the 19th century Tharparkar who in effect assembles a vigilante force of disciples to protect the poor. Dadi Mitha has at least 3 deputies who are incredible women in their own right with their own spiritual followings, also something I did not expect. This is in fact, I'll move on here. Her companion Dadi Saleha of the Mangrio clan, who set up a madrasa in the late 19th century. When Dadi Saleha and Dadi Mitha met, it said that they could bend space and time. We have a first-hand account of this. They would know exactly when to leave, and somehow there was a companion, an oral history directly from him, that somehow within moments that they were in a place that the two of them would meet in, and then the companion would sit a little bit further away and they would have a piece of gur and some bread, and they would talk for a while. The other was Dadi Kandal Halipoto, who dressed in men's clothes. She wore boots and a turban. She performed impossible 40-day fasts and seclusions, and she refused to get married. Then we have Dadi Gulaba Nehriyani, who would arrange for Dadi Mitha's tours of Rajasthan. She was literally, there were these tours. Each of the tribes would have these major da'wats for her, and that's how she would do her tabligh work. And then she would lecture. Now, I should also mention that another of the Khalifas of BB Sahiba's great-grandson was a man from 𝑢𝒒𝒑 named Miu Jan Muhammad, who was a Neem Madzub. Part of the time he was sane, part of the time he seemed insane. Long red hair and an orange coat and ajrak. He was trained by his mother, who was also a great Sufi, and then granted his spiritual authority to his daughter Bayrahat, who was well respected as a wali by all the Deobandi Maulvis of 𝑢𝒒𝒑 and Thar. Bayrahat then passes her spiritual authority to another woman who passes away, in fact, not that long ago. And I've been fortunate to have met many elders who personally knew Bayrahat and 𝑭𝒒𝒔𝒕𝒊. These are.
Where is this?
Oh, this is south of 𝑢𝒒𝒑. South of 𝑢𝒒𝒑. Now, just mention this, the Imam of the Jami Masjid of 𝑭𝒎𝒂𝒍𝒆, he's a good friend of mine, a conservative, old school Deobandi from 𝑭𝒆𝒈𝒊𝒂𝒍𝒆. His father, Maulana Abdul Rahman Jamali, was the head of this largest Deobandi madrasa in the region, and he's the one who preserved a lot of the history of these great female saints, and he translated the Mughal princess Zeb-un Nisa's poetry from Persian to Sindhi. It's published. And he's loved by Muslims and Hindus of 𝑭𝒎𝒂𝒍𝒆 for his insaniyat. There's some, in fact, I've seen people in the bazaar in 𝑭𝒎𝒂𝒍𝒆 who virtually have tears in their eyes when they talk about Maulana Jamali. Now, why were there so many female Sufi leaders in this part of the world? What was their societal role? How was their authority established? Why doesn't anyone have a problem with this? These are the questions that I answer in my book. So to reiterate, why does all of this matter? First, of course, these are stories that need to be told of an indigenous model of female leadership that exists within the moral framework of the region. Keep in mind that this silsila is still the largest religious network in Afghanistan today. Okay? You can fill in the gaps as to why the story is so important. Second, this, by the way, is a seal of the great Kandahari Sheikh, which also mentions BB Sahiba. This is another really fabulous artifact. Second, the built environment and hints in the literature point to many other contemporary women in leadership positions. For example, as I said, the largest Khanaqah in the Peshawar Valley, which had the largest land endowment in the entire Durrani Empire, all of the Waqf, the Awqaf department's lands in KP actually belong to this Khanaqah, virtually all. This is the largest network in the Eastern Afghan Empire, and it's led by 2 generations of women in the early 19th century. But we know virtually little about them. But in fact, myself and my dear friend Kashifuddin Chauhan and Malik Farooq Shamkani are actually now on a hunt, and the stories are coming to light. There are also mujaddidis like BB Sahiba, just recently following the strangest of leads. Following actually, if I may be honest, a whisper and a dream. We end up on the Afghanistan border, on the Kunar border, at a shrine, and by a bizarre set of circumstances end up finding the original land documents by which the first of the BBs inherited about 50,000 acres of prime land. These are orchards. From these Bajor, it wasn't Dir back then, Dir to Mardan, Malakan, Swat, down to Mardan, and then down to Kohat. These are probably the first documents, certainly the first documents I've ever seen in the entire Muslim world that prove that spiritual authority went along with temporal authority for female sheikhs. And I guarantee you that spiritual and temporal authority, financial authority, go hand in hand for these female sheikhs. My guess is they're... So it's quite a simple issue that when a sheikh proves herself for himself, they will get land that may be land that is at the time not arable. It may be land that has been refused. It may be land that's just simply gifted. Sarai is what is generally referred to in this area, and the tribes will generally give, let's say, 1/10 of their produce or a certain part of their produce to these institutions, and then it's their responsibility to set up the langar, to provide the social services, and then to actually finance their educational networks. So all of this to say the narratives of BB Sahiba and her successors can actually provide context for those who are marginalized in our history. She points to the existence of a significant world that has been erased. These are the documents, some of the documents, by the way. All right. In the conclusion of my book, I present a fascinating text, we call it a polemical text or a legal text, written in the late 1990s by a Sufi master from Bara in the Khyber Agency, right next to the border. If anyone knows, this is Pir Saif al-Rahman, who had one of the biggest religious networks in Afghanistan, also in Pakistan. One of his disciples had actually set up one of the, probably the first of the major Mujahideen factions in Afghanistan. 3 women, Sufis from Lahore, wrote to him complaining that some people were arguing that women could not be Sufi masters. So he responds with a 20-page tract in Persian and Arabic and then translated into Urdu, arguing that women's leadership of Sufi orders is completely valid, and it ends with 4 pages on BB Sahiba's story as a key part of the evidence. I'll stop here. Thank you.